when the IFU rules came, like, it was apparent I wasn't been able to play with the boys anymore, it actually changed my path, because I physically couldn't play rugby anymore. So it was like, right, that was my friendship group every week. That was my thing that I was good at, that I loved doing. 2015-16 season, I'd injured my knee, and they'd told me I'd never play again, and that was when I really struggled mentally, and I was getting help for severe depression, and it was awful. Like, it was everything, all of my previous operations, everything that had come to a head. And it wasn't until someone had said, "This is the place for you to be you," and instantly it was like, woof.
How's it going?
Yeah, I'm good.
You have to rate it out of 10. How are you feeling today?
Today, probably a 6 or so, not at my best in terms of the... It's interesting because I have a very fortunate professional life in that I do some really cool stuff and I get lots of variety. But then sometimes when you crank everything up all at the same time, it gets quite difficult to know which brain to put in which conversation, and you hop around, and that lack of consistency is always good in some senses, because I think anything that's too monotonous I would switch off from, but also can be quite challenging. So yeah. There's a lot going on in rugby at the moment, and I think I feel that, especially given the two clubs that were involved with Wasps and Worcester, being a past player, knowing the history of them, the relationship that's built over time with the men's game, where the Women's Premiership is, the fact that I sit now in a formal role with the Women's Rugby Association, how we can help those players, but just on a personal level, the people, the coaches, the players that have lost their jobs and that type of thing. So I think that side of it is underneath, and then also working in the media is wonderful, and I absolutely love the opportunities that I get, but that comes also at an emotional toll, in that I want to do the absolute best, because we're not only are the girls showcasing the game on the field, we're showcasing it in the studio and bringing it to life for people at home. And we're probably one of their first touch points with the game if they tune in at the start or in the middle when we're analysing. So that, coupled with living in Rome and working in England, mum not being very well at the moment, and also buying and selling houses. Who knew that was complicated? So yeah, I think it's, when you break it down, we just get on with life, don't we? We crack on. But when you break it down and you realise just how many things your brain is having to cope with, and at the same time feeling like you've got to perform in all of those areas, it's like, where do I get the respite to be me and to relax? And I think that's where I'm just trying to balance at the moment.
So I'm hearing there's loads going on. Who is Nolli? Who are you? What's your past been to get to where we're having this conversation today?
Oh, girl that grew up in the West Country, close with my family, privilege of having two big brothers that I would regularly be described as a ball of fight, but was really fortunate, I think, growing up, that I had parents that didn't treat me as the little girl or any different to my brothers. I was just Nolli, and so if I wanted to win in anything, I had to earn the right to win. And I was also, if I wanted to go to rugby, I went to rugby. It was just, there was no difference between us. I spent 4.5 years in New Zealand as well, and I think that from that point of view, the outlook on life, the way that sport is runs through the veins, and the life of your community, I think that taught me and my family how important it was, but to enjoy it all together. And we would play family touch, and fundamentally a lot of my values were grown there, because I was there from 5 to 9, which is a lot, it's a big important time in a young person's life. It was interesting though, because we moved with my mum and her partner at the time, and my dad was in the UK. So I think that sense of then building, we always had a relationship with my dad. It wasn't ever any difficulty, but just being however many thousands of miles away was always a challenge, seeing him 3 times in 4 years. So I think that definitely helped shape who I was, and where rugby came into it was, I was fast-tracked into, once I did under-16s rugby, fast-tracked into, as a 15-year-old, England Academy with senior players. The next youngest was Rocky Clark, 4 years older than me, so we were the babies at 15 and 19. But my dad was the one that would take me and drive me to Loughborough from Minehead, and drive me to London, and drive me all over the country. And I think that was a real opportunity for me to build that. And he, fundamentally, he was my support from a rugby perspective all the way through my career. He allowed me to be the player that I was. Mum was my number one fan, I'm not going to take that away from her, and was the emotional support as a mum would be, but to have my dad within that as a constant. And even now with my performance in the media, he steps in and will give me feedback and make it a sandwich. I won't say the swear word in between.
So would you say your dad was a big influence on the rugby side of your life?
I just think he was part of that. I loved it because my dad played, my brothers played, like it was just something that we all did. I just loved every aspect of playing with the boys. But I think as I transitioned into the women's game, it was new for me. Like I'd had 2 years from playing. I couldn't play with the boys, so then it was like finding women's rugby. What did that look like? And I think having that consistent person to lean on through that, from a technical and tactical perspective, but also just from a growth point of view. And he's a very different person to my mum, and the way that he looks at life, and being a head teacher and a maths teacher, you can kind of gather probably what he was like for me. And I think that was pretty important. And yeah, I think having big brothers was also a massive thing for me in terms of not being treated any different. Gave me the view in life, like why, like gender isn't really a thing until you get older and people start telling you, oh, you know, you can't play rugby because you're a girl with the boys. You can't do this because, like, oh, there isn't any. And now I'm like, oh, you know, you're the first to commentate on this, or you're the and it's like, it's actually mad to think that that's, but it's how I've approached it, in that actually it shouldn't matter.
When would you say the first time you heard someone tell you you can't do that because you're a girl?
Probably when I genuinely remember a dad on the sideline playing mini rugby shouting, "Tackle her, she's only a girl." Like, I genuinely remember it. I remember being absolutely livid and battering the boys. Like, anyone that came near me, I was like the Tasmanian devil, thinking, and saying to my mum after, like, how can someone say, like, I'm only a girl? Like, just being like completely infuriated. And then when the RFU rules came, like, it was apparent I wasn't been able to play with the boys anymore. And it was interesting because, you know, I was one of the best players, and one of the hardest things was actually that end of season dinner with my team, and all of the team being upset about it as well. And like, it was like, oh my gosh, this player that is one of our better players, she loves tackling, like, is such an influential figure, just isn't allowed. But that's probably the first I experienced it, but also it actually changed my path, because I physically couldn't play rugby anymore. So it was like, that was my friendship group every week. That was my thing that I was good at, that I loved doing. I think probably there was a couple of emotions for me. It was the frustration that someone was telling me that I couldn't do something that I knew I was good enough. And it was more frustrating that they were making a decision for me when they didn't know me, they didn't know, they were doing it for my safety, but yet I believed that I could make that decision for myself. Like, I knew and I could sense that at that time I was probably one of the biggest in the team. As a young girl, I'd matured earlier. There was one or two boys that were about the same in terms of physicality. I knew that I'd probably have one more year in me, and then there would be a shift change in the boys' maturity and the physicality, and then and that challenge, that being a little bit too much. But it was the fact that it was the frustration that I had that decision taken away from me, I think. Also, just the feeling of loss, you know, like kind of grief, like a miniature version of grief, because I couldn't do it anymore. It was taken from my life, and there wasn't an alternative at all. There was nothing, and processing that. And I think, again, it's hard, because when you think about grief, and you think about the loss of a family member or someone that you know, whatever it is, and actually it's still the same process when something ends or finishes in your life, whether that's a relationship, whether that's, you know, you finish a job and you're going to start a new one, or you, like, I don't know, like all sorts. And I think that was hard for me. Fast forward a couple of years, so after at 14, I was right. My best mate is 3 years older than me, and we'd kind of said, right, we need to set up a girls' team. This is getting a bit silly now, like, we need to do it. And I was really fortunate that we had a big stronghold within her year group, and there was me and a couple of others, and we managed to convince the girls to play, and we had 2 fixtures. We had a home and away game. And I think just the training and getting back into it, I realised that actually women's rugby could be a thing. I didn't know about England. I had no access or anything to any female rugby players. I had no idea. Growing up, I just thought I'd be one of the first women to play in the men's team. That's what I thought, obviously, before I realised that I was going to be a lot smaller and women couldn't. But yeah, I think that was the starting process of finding out about women's rugby and going to near Bristol to play, and I was like, the big city, and then finding out about Southwest Trials, and I remember my mum waking me up on Southwest Trials morning, and I remember her saying, don't worry about today, the girls are probably going to be quite a lot better than you haven't played for a long time, but just go and enjoy the opportunity to meet other girls. And it was at Clifton Rugby Club, and so we drove to Bristol, and we got there, and I was like, I don't know anyone. I was a bit like, this has even stumped me. Like, this is quite a scary place to be when I'm like, you're the only one, you're the only person from your area that sounded like me and all those things. And I sat next to a girl that was like, she was so much taller than me. And I said, oh, do you know people? Because she looked like she was kind of one, and she was like, no. I was like, we were both like, should we be friends then? And like laughed about it and joked and ran out. And she's literally one of my best friends now. She was my bridesmaid at my wedding. And I was like, and it's really interesting because when I go back to what was girls rugby like for me when I transitioned into that friendship was probably the pillar and the stake in the ground that kept me in it. I think as much as you can say, well, I enjoy the rugby, in anything, you've also got to enjoy the environment and feel safe in the environment and feel that you belong. And I think that was something that I quickly realised, that actually I was different, I was from a different area, I was the only one, but actually the vast majority of the girls were in the same position. And that vulnerability that I shared as a bit of a joke with Sarah highlighted that very, very quickly. So yeah, that was my journey in. And from 15 years old, I was picked up by England, thrust into the senior academy, and I brought challenges as a youngster. But again, Rocky Clark, who was my friend, one of the first sessions, we realised that we were the 2 youngsters. She was a bouncer at uni, and I was like, oh my gosh, my friend is like security at a nightclub. And our friendship stayed through my career. So I think that when I look back at my rugby career, it's like, who are influences? And you can obviously look at coaches. I talk about my dad, I talk about my mum, I talk about those people, but actually those little friendships and those bonds with people that you go on the journey with are really important and have been really important to me.
Do you think if those friendships weren't made, you'd still had the career that you had?
I would have retired sooner if it wasn't for Rocky. 2015-16 season, I'd injured my knee, and they'd told me I'd never play again, and that was when I really struggled mentally, and I was getting help for severe depression, and it was awful. Like, it was everything, all of my previous operations, everything that had come to a head, and it was finally, right, you need to get this support to unpick all of that, the kind of layers of the onion. And I remember saying, I'm done, like I can't go through this. And then and my dad said to me, well, you've done everything in the game, just give up. And I was like, no, like, I'm going to Olympics. So anyway, we went to the Olympics, that was fine. And then I was like, this is too much. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be here. This is awful. I'm not having fun. It's not. And I remember being in a session, and we were training at Bisham Abbey, and Rocky lived nearby. And so she was doing bench, not very much. And she just said, oh, mate, stick around. We'll be here in a couple of weeks. We'll have a laugh. If the autumns go well, it's World Cup next year. You've got a big thing to aim for, just crack on. And genuinely, that was the thing that I was like, okay. Because I don't think if I had that conversation, I would have, it was just too much on lots of different levels. And I'm a big believer in enjoyment and passion, and the passion coming from enjoyment and enjoyment coming from passion. So if both of those have gone, if the candle's gone out and there's no more wax to burn, you're scrabbling around in the dark a bit. And that's how I felt a little bit with rugby.
Please say no if you don't want to go down this. In the sevens camp, the culture.
So the challenge with the sevens programme was we went from being professional with a little p athletes in an amateur world where we could come in and enjoy a weekend, 4-day camp, and then remove ourselves. You win a World Cup, you go through the campaign, it's brilliant. We worked really hard to build that mould, that team together, and then a proportion of that group of women get full-time contracts, you're thrust into an environment that isn't actually that nice. So we were in like some back room at Surrey Sports Park, in a corridor basically. So I think that actually just going from being able to control and choose our attitudes and choose how we worked, because we were able to remove ourselves when the camp finished, whereas then when it came into a full-time position, I don't think we managed that well, and it's a hard, very, very intense environment. So that side of things, I think that there were relationships within the squad that made it an interesting, challenging dynamic. Friendships within the squad that were clunky, weren't positive, you know, and alongside that, you also had this really competitive, we want to be that, and it was, yeah, I've got to prove myself on like a every moment basis rather than, you know, bring my best self and that will help the team, you know. If you played off against someone, it's like that battle, and the battle becomes personal if you sit with that person all day, every day. We didn't manage it as players. I think as a management, they had their challenges. The environment didn't help. It was new. We were also under the cosh because most of the other nations had gone professional. So we were behind it already. And as England, we didn't lose. That wasn't something that we were used to, but we were losing on a world stage. So you're questioning yourself, you're questioning the ability all the time. So it was a lot of things. Took a lot emotionally, took a lot of the fun out of it. And then it becomes a bit of forced fun, and then, you know, it's like a drag and something that... So 2000 was when I first got picked into England Senior Academy. So you fast forward like 14 years of like managing it, enjoying it, being something that wasn't always crazy, oh my gosh, definitely not. But on a daily, it became like a grind. And it never was that. And I think it was hard to feel that.
Did it leave a bad taste in your mouth?
It was a different journey for me because I only had the start of 2014 and into 2015 because in early 2015 was when I had my injury. And I spent four months in an intensive rehab unit for my knee, like at Bisham Abbey. So I was actually physically removed from the squad. And at the same time, I tumbled mentally because I was just holding it. And I'd convinced myself I was fine for years. And it wasn't until someone had said, this is the place for you to be you. And instantly it was like, woof. And then the barriers came down and everything. It was like, oh my gosh, where has this all come from? And I was really fortunate because I was in a place where I wasn't around the team, so I wasn't having to hold it together for them because I never wanted to, when you go into an environment where the team is bigger than you don't ever want your own personal stuff to be brought to the table to affect anyone. And I think that that's why I'd got so used to being the entertainer in the squad, the happy one and all of that stuff. But I got so good at it that I convinced myself and I never actually realised or reflected on where I was. And it took someone outside to be able to say that. And the doctor I was working with at the rehab unit with the British Limb Association gave me some papers and said, look, I just want you to read these. And one was on anxiety and one was on depression. So I just want you to read them in your own time and just let me know if you kind of resonate with anything or whatever. And it was an amazing way of reflection for me because if it was a conversation, I wouldn't have, there was too many barriers. But he did it on the back of having a conversation with me where it was a serious conversation. I was laughing and I was crying. So there was no connection with emotion and and what was coming out of my brain from a cognitive point of view. That was it. However, I was aware of it all of a sudden. I was aware that I was probably having these signals around I've got depression, but I was in one of the best rehab units in the world. I was, gunning for an Olympic Games. I'd actually broken up with my boyfriend, but I have a great family. Like, do you know what I mean? There was, and it was like, I can't feel like this. I shouldn't feel like this. I've got too many good things going on. And so then it was a matter of convincing me that it was okay to do it and to have the help. And actually it was the doctor at the time who was working with us, and she knew me personally really well, and she just said, look, you rehab 5 times a day, 7 days a week. This is just one of your rehab sessions. Forget about it being your brain. Just, it's part of your rehab.
One of the questions I do ask a lot is, have you ever hidden emotions out of fear? Have you? Do you?
Yes and no. I think I was always a player, and probably if you speak to my teammates, they knew how I felt. I think what I didn't show was how being super open and being comfortable, like I would cry through frustration. I cry, like even like now, or through like all sorts of things. And what I didn't ever tell people was actually how hard it was, because I always felt stupid to share those emotions, and that it was a weakness for me to be so open with everything. And actually, only recently have I worked with a group of women where they said, you've got to look at it as a super strength, because I always saw it as my biggest weakness, was being so open emotionally.
Being in those high performance environments, being in the public eye, what's it like? It's
interesting, so I have lots of different roles. So I think one thing I've realised is how hard it is, and how it takes its toll on you without even realising. And I think when I first got into the media, I didn't realise how much anxiety I was having in the build-up to working. And then also, as soon as the final whistle went in my commentary, how much I then relived so much of the game. So, yeah, I think I didn't realise how hard and tough it was going to be, because fundamentally, as much as you might have got the knowledge, you're moving into a totally different path. And then it's disseminating that knowledge and making it interesting, coupled with the fact that I was going into the men's game, and the placement of a female within that environment, which was reasonably new, change for people which they don't like. So yeah, it was really hard to start off with. That said, I was very lucky, and I'm still very lucky to work with some unbelievable professionals. When I was struggling and when I was finding it difficult, a number of them, men and women that work within the media, in particular rugby media, reached out to say, I get this as well, or I've gone through this, I get it, and you're not alone. I was really fortunate to have that support from people. You know, Craig Doyle rang me and was like, I'm just checking in, I'm going to give you some feedback, but I also want to talk to you about how you are. And I think that made a massive difference. Someone I really respected from within that world, taking the time to talk to me, but also be really vulnerable about his own experiences, and that shared experience of the challenges that we were facing, I think made it a massive difference for me.
You've spoken about your experience of some
trolling.
What sort of things would you receive? Like what?
All sorts. The vast majority of them was like, why are you here? Like, you don't have the qualifications, you don't have like the knowledge, you don't belong in this space, because I'm a woman rather than a man. They'd also attack my actual delivery, so which is kind of what you get as a new person in the media as a pundit, because it is such a skill set. So there was that around the technicality, which is always hard, because you're like, when you're such a perfectionist like I am with the technical detail around like catch, pass, you know, whatever it is from a playing point of view, to then deliver. But then there was the other side of it. So it was the kind of 3 sides, and then the other side of it was, you know, coming and attacking my voice, or and the tone, the pitch, like fundamentally the fact I was a woman, without saying I was being a woman, you know. And I think what was really, really difficult about the trolling was I got into massive rabbit holes. And I knew exactly where to search. It wasn't even just things where I was getting tagged. It was like this massive vulnerability, and also need to search what people were saying. So I could search my name, I could search female commentator, I could search all of these things. And you become like, not obsessed with it, but it just became so overwhelming, because the more I looked, the more I found. And it was like all these people making these comments about me on literally my first day of work. And then it got to the point, and I genuinely am gutted that I didn't screenshot it, because there was a comment that said, Nolli Waterman is one of the worst pundits, commentators, whatever. She shouldn't be working for you at ITV Rugby. It's like ruined the game or something like that. And it was a woman that was a psychologist. And she hadn't tagged me, but she had tagged ITV. And I'm genuinely gutted I didn't screenshot it, because that stopped me in my tracks. My knowledge of psychologists and mental health, and I just thought, this is madness. And I remember just freezing and just when people like that are saying those types of things. And I was so worried. It wasn't actually when they tagged me. It was when they kept tagging ITV. And then they kept tagging Channel 4. And like my only example, like for anybody, imagine you going in your first week of work, your boss getting hundreds of messages telling them how they've made the biggest mistake ever hiring you and that you're so rubbish that you've actually physically affected their day. And it's just now I laugh and I think it's bonkers. At that point, I was distraught.
Do you want to see what they say? Is there something there?
I think it's human nature to want to know what people say about you. Like, we always want to be, naturally want to be liked when we go into a room, and we want people to think that we're good at what we do. And yeah, it is still there. I do still look at my phone. I just look at it through a different lens now. What I now know is that the vast majority of people would never say it to your face. They think it's funny or a joke, or you're just literally a piece of wood throwing it on the bit of wood that they throw on the fire to try and make their little flame burn but brighter. And actually, it's nothing to do with me, but it's taken me 3 years for that.
You said you look at things with a different lens, and you touched on sort of the things you tell yourself, what you can now do for steps. But how did you get to that lens?
What I make sure I do now is I try to make sure I verbalise some things. If I'm thinking it, and then the next day I wake up and I'm thinking it, or I wake up in the night thinking it, that day, somewhere, I will try and reach out, or I will try and make sure that I've put in place somewhere a conversation that I can have, because I know that talking with people that I respect and that have an understanding around it gives me perspective back. Because I think it's when you lose perspective that it becomes the biggest challenge, because you always think, it's why me? What have I, like, it's like that. And it's like, actually, it's the whole piece. I think the other side of it, and where I'm challenged at the moment, is having my own time away from it and perspective of life. And for me, one of the ways I deal with that is walking my dog. Making sure I can go out with my dog and I don't take my phone. And instantly, I'm not thinking, I do process a bit of stuff, but I'm also thinking, I'm laughing at her, crazy Labrador, I'm laughing at her, or trying to talk Italian to somebody. And it's making sure I drip feed those moments into my life and not get caught in this whirlwind of professional kind of performance all the time. It wasn't sustainable, trying to balance everything. And so I decided to write a list of everything I was doing, but the list was in order of what really made me happy. What was the things that when I write about it or think about it, my eyes lit up and smiled. And it was a really interesting process for me, because it came out in an order I would never have predicted. I think in life, so many people, we think we have to do it. And I think it's really important to remember that there are things we have to do, and we might have to do them for short, medium, long term because of paying bills, because of life, right? But there are so many things that we have control over. But it's getting that control. How can you own that control? Because if I make a decision, who's telling me that's a silly decision?
What would you suggest for someone that may not realise they've got a network around them, or they don't feel like they have that ability to be able to talk?
One of the biggest things for me is I often don't feel like I can be upset or I can say things are tough, because I know I have a fantastic husband. We have a wonderful dog, and living in Rome, and I do some really cool work, and I've got some great friends, and so I often think I can't say to somebody, I'm really struggling, or this is really hard, because I always go, yeah, but they've got it worse, or there's always, and I think it's that ability to say, it's irrelevant of what you do or where you are or what's happening in your life. If you feel sad, that's okay, or if you need help, that's okay. And I have that inner dialogue a lot with myself, in that, who can I speak to? Because I don't want to put my problems onto somebody that I see has got far worse than me, you know. And I think it's not a competition, and it's not a leveling thing. And I suppose with finding people to talk to, it's understanding that they don't have to be your best friend or family, and actually speaking to a like-minded person or someone within a community like a rugby club or within your workspace that is removed from your personal sphere actually sometimes is the best conversations, because they don't have any judgment, they don't have any reason to be biased in what the outcome of the conversation is, or the history, or whatever that you hold with whoever you're talking to.
Being in the public eye, do you feel like sometimes you have to wear a mask or be a different character?
I think the one thing I've always tried to be is me. So like the vast majority of the time, I don't feel like I'm having to put a mask and to be a different person. It's just, am I good enough? And unfortunately, as it's crazy as it sounds, I at times feel like I am representing women's rugby. And because if that's someone's one touch point with women's rugby, I'm telling the story of women's rugby in terms of, do I know my business in terms of the technical, tactical of the game? What do I look like? What do I sound like? How are my relationships with my peers when it comes across on TV or whatever? Is there respect that you can see, feel, hear? And I think that's one of the hardest things. And that's why I'm so hard on myself, that I want to make sure, because I think we're rock stars in the women's game, that having a seat at the table with the men's game, I'm not just there to tick a box. I'm there to move people's thoughts, feelings, knowledge about the women's game forward. So they don't have to be somebody that is regularly watching women's rugby to respect it if I've done my job properly. So the performance side of stuff and the ability to be, am I good enough? So on a personal level, do they like me? Am I okay? Am I, but also professionally, am I good enough? Because I'm representing an army. And that's a lot of pressure at times. But the more I build the relationships with my male peers and that type of thing, and the more I do, the more I realise that they don't see me as that. They don't see me as represent. And also, the more women getting involved, it shows that we're all, of course, we're all representing the women's game, but also I'm just Nolli. Like, I'm not women's rugby. But I think that's just something that comes with the territory whilst we're in this kind of transition phase of growing the game from lots of angles.
What needs to change? What do you think's missing, or do you think it's all great?
I think that there's loads to change and develop and progress at a sustainable rate. I think there's more eyeballs and knowledge that we need to do something than there ever has been at the moment. But it's making sure that what is being done is very strategic and also worthwhile, and not just to pat yourself on the back, but actually to influence the people you're helping. I think one of the things and one of the areas in women's rugby that I would love to see grow is the women in rugby in the off-field side of the game. So not just at minis and juniors, if you're a mum, you do the teas and coffees and the admin. That you're a coach, that you're an analyst, that you can do things if you want to do them. And I think that pigeonholing in terms, I remember when I coached, ran Hartbury College programme, and I'd turn up and my assistant coach, who's a volunteer, he would come, fantastic guy, Jersey, he would come, and they would instantly go to him and they would ask, at one point they said to me, "Oh, it's fantastic, you've got physio." And I was like, "Oh, we don't." I was one of my things, and they were like looking at me, and I was looking at them thinking, Oh, you think I'm the physio? Oh, no, I'm a level 3 coach. No, I'm the head coach of this program. I run all of this. But they would go straight to the guy. And I think that breaking down those barriers and that knowledge, and I don't think, and I try to think that people don't do it, they do it out of habit and normality rather than sexism and being misogynistic, do you know what I mean? And I think trying to break that down, that you can see a female and they might not be the medic or the mum, they might actually be the coach, or, you know, like that type of thing, and that rippling up to the elite level of the game. You know, at the World Cup, there's one female head coach. That needs to change, because I know there are amazing coaches, but it's the process and program around giving them the opportunity to be experienced enough, good enough, qualified, all of those things, right? So you've got that side of it, but then the other side of it is we need to be encouraging women to have the confidence to take that step themselves. How many times can I tell you there's this opportunity, there's this course, there's this, go and do it. And so we need to break down lots of barriers with women. And I think, as I say, the game, and I personally think England Rugby have done a fantastic job of the branding around the social coverage that the women have got. It feels different, it sounds different, it looks different to the men's. It looks different to the RFU that's ever done. And I love that. So how can we translate that into more women and girls playing, but more women and girls within the game that aren't those stereotypical roles?
How do you think we should do it?
One of the biggest challenges, if you look at the corporate world and business, is about understanding the role with diversity and inclusion, and how many boardrooms look the same. They have the same education, they are the same age, they've had the same career progression and pathway. And it's not a natural thing for humans to like change. Tend to sit on the same seat when we go to lunch, we tend to eat the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, so change is hard. It's understanding that change is a positive and how you embrace it. And actually, when you're giving people an opportunity, are you giving them an opportunity? Are you giving them a fair shot at this? Are you giving them the resource? You know, it's all well and good introducing a women's team at your club, but they have no changing rooms or awful changing rooms. They have the worst kit, so it's the hand-me-downs from the thirds from 10 years ago that's massive. They don't have the best qualified coaches, even though they probably need the best coaches because they're brand new into the game. They don't ever have a physio because actually the second team need a physio. You never play them on the first team pitch. Why would the women play on the first team pitch? You know, like stop and think about what you're asking someone that's new in a role, and if that was in any context of a opportunity, have they got the best chance to thrive, to enjoy it, to embrace learning? And I think that that's where we need to start, because too many times we say, of course they can come. Of course. Okay, you tell me how they're going to feel when they walk. Have you acknowledged how they're going to feel when they walk in the door? What mentoring program have you got in place? Is there anyone that looks like them in the room? Because if they don't, I go back to that 14-year-old Nolli going into a changing room, didn't know anybody, never done women's rugby before. Like, how scary that is. And lots of people don't face that until adulthood. And then as an adult, it's even worse. But I think around the women and girls piece, that said, there is also a massive side to embracing it not being perfect and being a bit gritty and having a leap of faith and not pointing a finger to say, you don't make me feel right. What can I control about how I feel? And where can I get resource and support to help me? So like, I felt really sorry for myself when I was getting trolled, but what can I do to change it? Who is out there to help me? And there were plenty of people to help me.
If you feel comfortable, if there's anything you've never told anyone, or even friends or family, that you feel like you've wanted to get off your chest for a while, that you feel might inspire somebody hearing it, that you've been able to take that step, would you feel comfortable sharing it?
I mean, I would, but I don't know whether there is anything, really. I suppose the biggest thing for me is that in my world, when you work in the media, And as a person, I love to smile and I love to make the room smile. And that doesn't always mean that I'm smiling on the inside. And I think understanding how people portray themselves can be for other people, not just actually their reality. And I live in that space a fair amount at times. And I think I'm aware of it and I've acknowledged it and I'm okay with it to an extent. It's when I'm doing it and there isn't the real smile coming through at times and at moments when I give myself that time. So I think, yeah, I always call it the Instagram life. Don't be fooled by an Instagram life. Don't be drawn into that. And that's not, and the reason I'm sharing it is because it's not just me. Everyone has those people in their lives. You know, when I told my dad about my depression, he said, but you're the happy one in the family. You're the entertainer. And it's really interesting because it's amazing how vulnerable people can be behind a smile.
So you have a friend, they're struggling at the rugby club, just a mate, in general. What advice or what steps would you take to help them?
Firstly, acknowledge them as a person and try to remove them from that teammate or profession and try and get them to be them. And I think sometimes, or I know, the location of talking to someone is a really important one in terms of allowing someone to relax. And, you know, I think strangely, one of the best places to have a conversation where someone is really struggling to open up is in a car or for a walk. So we think it's in a cozy room and we sit and we're very intense and we're looking at each other and I'm giving all of this love to you. But all that does is put all of this pressure on someone being looked at. And I've found that when I've had some of my hardest conversations as being on the person challenged versus the person listening, have been in the car or have been on a walk because I'm not looking at them. I have my own space to breathe and to look, but at the same time they're there. And if I've needed to stop and look or stand, you can do that on a walk. And I think that is, I know it sounds really silly, but it's often overlooked. But also, prior to that conversation, try and identify what type of person they are. Are they somebody that doesn't mind being challenged or would open up? Are they somebody that's quite guarded? Do they like humour? You know, give them some of their things to relax them. And I think the other bit is, however bad you think it might be, saying something out loud can often reduce that quite significantly because all we do is escalate in our minds. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this. I think that's everything.
Enjoy editing.
Oh.